What's it like doing comedy? Because I think there's a lot of people, and myself included, who like the idea of like New York comedy is
Yeah.
just the coolest part of comedy.
Right.
To think do like
Um,
Caroline's, your comedy
right.
set, all that kind of stuff. That to me just seems like the best place to do comedy.
Yeah, I mean, I got to perform in a lot of those rooms. I got to perform on that stage at Caroline's about half a dozen times over the years. That was a beautiful, great energy in that room. It had a weird, like a few of the places. I don't know if it's the same in Scotland, but um, most comedy venues, you don't want to be there when the lights get turned on
Oh
because
God,
you
no.
see you see just how threadbare and gross and grimy and
Yeah,
oily and worn out. There's a particular depth of wear and tear on those places. So like Caroline's had a funny thing because it was new by those standards because it looked like it had been renovated maybe in the 90s. So
yeah.
with the lights dimmed and when you'd show up for show, it felt kind of newish. But then the lights on there also, you could see that, the 90s are now quite a long time ago.
We're past that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it ha
That's it.
it's grimy. And then the most grimy and a very fun club that closed but is now threatening to open again. I heard that someone bought it was Rodney Dangerfield's club, which was called Dangerfield's.
Yes, yeah.
Open for about I think 30 years, 35 years and man, that really felt like stepping into a time machine. Very
Really.
fun room to go into, but like the little lamps on each table and a red tablecloths and the black walls and black ceiling and just go on YouTube and check out Dangerfields, all the big names from the 80s. You could see Billy Crystal, you could see Seinfeld, you could see Dangerfield himself. Like in those videos from 1985 or whatever, nothing changed at all. Those are the same tablecloths, same paint job on the stage. It was an incredibly like retro, but
Yeah.
it was just great. It was cool. It was like stepping
And
into.
even when that reopens, they won't do any renovations to it, will they?
I'm assuming they will. They're going to have to. I don't know how the health department would let that place open up, but
Yeah.
yeah,
I
that's
mean, it
that's
must be pretty cool to do comedy in those rooms, though, because they are like iconic rooms.
yeah, and also you go into like the comic strip, which is the one on the east side on Second Avenue and 82nd Street, like the Upper East Side. Um, they have great displays on the walls, like the photos of all the people. Again, you're seeing their headshots from the 80s when they started out, like Eddie Murphy and Seinfeld and Adam Sandler and Sarah Silverman and all these people. But in addition to those, so it ends up looking like their high school yearbook photos because these are
Yeah.
faces that but when they were, way younger. But in addition to that, they have some really cool stuff on the wall. They have when Seinfeld took the train in from Long Island and did his audition spot at the comic strip, there was the guy who owned that club and who just passed away a year ago. He was the one who would watch and then give you notes and pass you. In other words, like,
Yeah.
hey, you're on, you can come in and do more sets. So they had a framed note from him, um, his basically like his little review of Seinfeld's very first time ever getting up. It's
Right.
sitting
What did
there,
I
it's
say?
framed there. Yeah, and it's very positive. It's
Well,
encouraging,
yeah,
and
you'd hope so, yeah.
yeah,
Because that's the
yeah,
one he did that. He did his last special back at the comic strip, didn't he? I'm pretty
exactly.
sure he did a kind of like, this is where I started. I'm coming back.
Not only did he go back to the same venue, but he resurrected his first jokes. So if you watch
Yes.
that special from the comic strip, I think it's from like 2018 or 2017, whatever it was. He went back, he did his old material, um, which is such a cool idea. But when Seinfeld decided to tape his special, he wanted the stage back where it was when he first started doing comedy there. He actually paid for them to renovate and move the stage
That
back to where it was.
the power of that man in New York
Yeah.
comedy is unparalleled.
Yeah, the power and then also the very deep pockets from all of
Yeah.
those
Which is
residual
so
checks.
weird to
Yeah.
think when he is a billionaire, but keeps it on the
Right.
down low and
Yeah.
still does stand up, still does
Yeah.
it writing every day, all this, and you're thinking, wow, man, that guy is hardcore.
It's amazing, and it's so in his blood. And he even says that, I heard at the beginning of one of his Netflix specials recently, where I think he addressed that right out of the gate. He's basically saying to the audience, like, what am I doing here? Why am I here?
Yeah,
What am I like? It's very funny that he does that, because the audience on some level has to be thinking like, you're still doing
yeah,
this. But
yeah. But it's so weird because he is just like he doesn't. You wouldn't think a billionaire would still do that, but he's still
mm,
just honing
yeah.
the sets, working away, and it's grafting. And hats off to him. He is dedicated and he is obsessed with it. The kind of famous thing you hear about gigging in New York comedy is like so and so dropping in, Dave
Oh,
Chappelle
right.
dropping in. Have you ever
Yeah.
been in the clubs and people have
Yeah.
just turned up?
Yeah. The most noteworthy example of that for me was at a really nice, there's a great club called the West Side Comedy Club. You were mentioning how there's pizza upstairs at the Yes Bar, or there was.
Yeah,
At the West Side Comedy Club, there's a Mexican restaurant upstairs
love it.
called Playa, like beach, Playa Betty. So Playa Betty, very good Mexican restaurant. Downstairs, a fantastic comedy club, the West Side Comedy Club. And I was there one night, and it was uh Bill Burr
Oh
who
my
showed
god.
up. And so I got to chat with him. He was very let's say he was willing to indulge my interest in saying hello to him and taking a selfie. But I very clearly got the vibe. I got the vibe very clearly that he was like, he was there to work. So
Yeah,
he was polite about it. But so that was cool. I think I got to follow him, which is they always say you don't want to follow those incredible world class greatest comedians of all time. But I don't know if that's
yeah,
true, because obviously they warm up, if you want to think of it that way. They really
yeah,
warm up the crowd like no one else.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think
oh,
if you, it's almost a bit of a challenge to then have to follow them. I mean, it's an excellent chance it might not go well,
right.
but what a challenge to come on and follow and try and just do something with that. How often are you going to get that?
Yeah. I have friends they had that happen to them at Gotham, which is one of the great clubs in New York
Yeah,
in Chelsea on West 23rd Street. Um, I have friends who got bumped because Seinfeld showed up. He'll just show up there to do a set. And so, um, but also then it's cool. You were on a show with Seinfeld.
yeah. I can imagine he would not be up for entertaining selfies.
Yeah, good question. I get that vibe also, but who knows?
Yeah, you'd be like,
Surprise.
no, because
Yeah,
he's such a purist. He would probably just see
right.
you as like, even though you aren't an equal, he'd maybe be like, oh, no, no, we're kind of, you don't ask for selfies with your
Right.
peers.
Yeah. It was funny on this the Screen Actors Guild, the Actors Union here in the States was on strike for 4 months. And so I was at the picket line for the last month of it. I was away before that. But so that was an interesting place, because there you're walking around in on the picket line for a few hours. It would go for 2.5 hours every morning, and you're seeing lots of celebrities and lots of character actors, people whose faces you recognize, but you don't
Yeah,
know their
yeah,
names. And so definitely for the first, let's say, 25 out of the 28 days I was there, I was just decided I'm going to leave everyone alone. I'm just a member of the same union. I'm walking around in a circle. I am not going to bother anybody and take a selfie. It seems antithetical to the spirit of a strike, which is a
yeah.
union. We're all in this together. I'm not here to be your fan. I'm not here to bother you.
Solidarity.
Yes, solidarity. We're going to be screaming up at the windows of the Netflix offices. That's what we're here for. But sure enough, on like the last 2 days, I was like, oh, can we get a selfie? And so it's
Who
the
did you
world we
meet?
live in. It's a little irresistible.
Oh yeah,
Um,
who was it? Who did you meet?
oh, um, so okay, I am so horrible with names, but there was one guy I would see there almost every day. And then he was incredible because he was bringing donuts, and he was like really super supportive of everybody else. He's an actor. His name is William. I'm spacing on his last name, but I know him from the show High Maintenance, which I got to do one episode of that, which was a web series that turned into an HBO show. Now he's become a big star because he's one of the main characters in the show with Steve Martin called Only Murders in the Building.
Oh, do you know what? I've not actually seen that yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So I haven't seen this season of it either that he's in, but now I know. It's funny, when I met him and chatted with him on the picket line, I mentioned High Maintenance, but he must have been thinking like, come on, man. Don't you know I'm much more famous now for this other show? But
Yeah, yeah, come
I
on.
just didn't know that that's what he was in.
Yeah. And what's it like? So early days trying to do comedy in New York. Are you
Yeah.
having to encounter some pretty rough gigs?
Um, yeah, I mean the whole thing. I got to the point where I recorded a special and I got, you know, getting regular gigs at really just a club or two in New York right before the pandemic was when my album was coming out and I was making some inroads with some of the clubs and the bookers, and that's when I was really pushing it. So, you know, up until then it was a lot of what, what you do there also, which is just getting on shows that are produced by friends or getting onto what they call bringer shows over here. I
Yeah.
don't know if you call them bringers there also,
We don't
but
have them here, but
yeah.
we know of them.
Yeah, the idea is like we'll give you 5 minutes of stage time if you bring five humans who are buying drinks. Yeah. So, it's not always 5 and 5, but it's a bringer show where you're required to bring some people. And then the other thing is open mics. There were a bunch of places where you could just get up and do your material. And yeah, and then of course, New York City is um geographically pretty small place, but then it's such an enormous metropolitan area. So there's
Yeah.
lots of venues and lots of clubs if you go, like, let's say a 50 or 100-mile radius outside. So one of the things that worked out for me was that I don't know if you have many comedy competitions in the
Yes.
UK.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was one that I did several years in a row that I recommend, even if someone wants to come from overseas to do it. It's called the World Series of Comedy, which of
Okay.
course is a misnomer. It's like the way we call the World Series in baseball the World
Yeah.
Series, even though it's just teams from over here.
Yeah.
The World Series of Comedy, a guy named Joe who ran it, who's a comedian, very funny guy, and he would hold what he called satellite competitions in like dozens of cities around the country. So local comedians would get up, compete in a few rounds. You know, there would be three winners, and those winners would then get invited to go to the main event. So at the end of months of him doing these satellite shows in every state in the country, he would then hold a main event in Las Vegas.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So you'd get to spend like 3 or 4 days in Vegas doing some more shows. And then like the big winner was crowned at the end of it all. And the grand prize for that big winner was actually pretty cool. They would get a little bit of money, but then they would also get booked into actual professional shows at various clubs in
Nice.
different states. So that was really cool. So I once won like one round of a satellite thing in Pittsburgh, and I did okay some other times. Sometimes I didn't pass even out of the first round. One time the last time I did it, it was insane. I drove all the way to St. Louis, which that would be like driving from like Inverness to like Brighton. It was like an
Holy
insane, it's like
shit. Right.
I
Yeah.
drove like 15 hours, did had lunch with a high school friend who lives out there. It's halfway across the United States.
Yeah.
I drove there, had lunch with a friend, did my 5 minute set, did not get past to the next round, and,
Oh, Ethan.
and drove all the way back. So I could have stuck around and watched a few more rounds, but I was dejected and I thought I got to get out of here. So
That is a long drive home.
that was brutal. Yeah. When you just said like any rough gig, so that would maybe qualify as the roughest. It was also really rough because that was the weekend when we had a really shameful um nomination of a Supreme Court justice named Kavanaugh here.
Yeah,
And
Brett
it turned out
Kavanaugh.
Kavanaugh, it turned out there were very credible allegations of sexual abuse made
Yeah.
against him. Very credible. And then shamefully, he ended up passing and getting his seat on the
Yeah.
court. And that entire drive out to St. Louis, I was listening to those congressional hearings. So the whole thing, yeah, it stands
That's
out as
some
a particularly
depressing
bleak.
listening.
Yes, yeah, that was a depressing situation. But here's what I wanted to say. I met people in that competition, including a
Uh-huh.
guy who runs a company called Slapstick Comedy in Pennsylvania. He ended up hiring me. He ended up, after seeing me in that competition, giving me some of my first professional comedy gigs, where I would then go out there. And at first I was the opener, then I was like the feature. I
Yeah.
don't think I ever ended up headlining for him, but I got like a good I probably worked for him like a good, 12, 15 times, where I would go out to Pennsylvania, perform, do comedy, get paid to do comedy. It was pretty modest. And sometimes they were like, it was like the spring girls high school lacrosse team spring fundraiser dinner with comedy. And then, but still, it was a comedy show. I was getting paid, and that was cool.
You didn't
So,
care. Yeah, that's it.
yeah,
As you're getting paid in the early days, you're like, this is the
yeah, it's
best
very
job in the
fun.
world.
That very first time you get a
Yeah.
dollar or $20. The first time for me was in San Diego at another competition where I got, after I performed, the guy handed me a $20 bill. I didn't even know he was paying me. It was so exciting. That
Yeah.
feeling of, oh, I'm a pro. So that was nice.
Yeah. I remember I
But
did
anyway,
that at my
that World
first
Series of
one.
comedy, you can meet lots and lots of people. So, and that can lead to gigs. Sorry, I cut
No,
you
no,
off.
no. I was just going to say my first one was in Aberdeen. My first time I ever got paid for a gig. The
Yeah,
guy gave me 20 quid, and I was like, I am never going to spend this again. And
right.
I think
Yeah,
I'd like lost my wallet that night as well. So then
yeah.
the next day I had to get back to Edinburgh. And I had to spend that money. And I was like, well, there goes that.
There you
There goes
go.
that sentimentality for me.
I have this show I've been doing since the strike began. Now that the strike's over, I'm still doing it. But I go on Instagram Live every night at 9 p.m., which would be, I guess, 2 a.m. in
Yeah.
Edinburgh. Um, but I made the decision for it to not be a political, not a news show, not talking about any current events, which it turns out is that was cool and fun, but it also is challenging, because when
Yeah. God, yeah.
the world is so crazy and on fire, it's like, the elephant in the room that you're not talking about. It's hard to not.
Yeah.
So
And were people kind of jumping in at the comments trying to get you
yeah,
to talk about? Yeah.
yeah. I literally, like, I actually had that happen when I was talking about nothing related. Someone just happened into the show and said, um, in the comments, "Are you talking about Gaza here?" And I was, I didn't know what I was like. Well, no, I'm not, but and I kind of don't want to, but I
Yeah.
guess if you want, but yeah,
Holy shit, man. Yeah.
yeah.
That is
And then
not, there's
over,
nothing that kind of derails comedy more than
right.
war.
Yeah, and in fact, there are some comedians who touch on it, which is pretty impressive. The attempts, and often it
Yeah.
seems to me, from the little I've seen, often they're failed attempts, but you got to give them credit for trying.
I think if you can find the angle,
Yeah,
yeah, I wouldn't go for it.
no,
There's
yeah,
no chance I would go for it. It's just because
yeah,
if it, you lose the room, if you
absolutely.
swing and a miss,
Yeah,
you've lost
yeah,
the room. Which I
yeah,
get, take risks here and there, but it's also like I'm not out there to kind of make political points in my comedy. So it's
right.
just like I'll leave that to other people.
Yeah. I had a joke. When you say lose the room, I had that experience very intensely. I did a show out in Michigan, a number of years ago, and I had this joke that had a sort of tag on it, and so the joke was about being a vegan, and I basically say, I'm not trying to proselytize, but my feeling is basically like, if you're a person who can, like, look the cow in the eye and then develop a relationship with it and then kill it and butcher it and eat it, then I say, yeah, go ahead, you should be eating meat. Um, which is kind of, and then this is where it went off the rails for this particular audience. I said, I kind of feel like the same way about human trafficking. Like, if you're a guy, if you can look a kid in the eye and say, look, you're a really nice kid and all, but I have a mortgage payment I have to make, so I'm selling you to, then you should be a human trafficker. So this particular
Holy shit,
audience,
man!
the room went completely silent,
Fuck.
silent and horrified, and I just moved it along. But you know what? I actually think it's on my album. Come to think of it, I did end up retooling that joke, so it did
Yeah,
work. But when I first broke it out, man, that those people in Michigan, they didn't dig
I
it.
didn't see that coming, and I love that when you don't
Yeah.
see a joke coming, you
Yeah.
suddenly the switch to human trafficking and children.
Yeah.
My God, man!
Yes. Yeah. Um,
But I bet when that landed, it landed big.
yeah, yeah. It ends up getting a good laugh. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's cool,
I
man.
don't think yeah, I didn't get into much politics at all. That was another thing where, like, you can imagine, for the last decade now almost, there's so much about our wannabe dictator, and so much comedy about him and impressions of him and the
Yeah,
latest news and lampooning his insanity and all of that. I just avoided that 100% the whole time, out of a
yeah.
feeling of, like, I don't have anything to add here. Um,
Because if you go to a show and there's six comics in the lineup and
Yeah.
everyone's got a trunk joke, you'll
Yeah.
stand out as the person that didn't do that.
Yeah. Oh, right. For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah. I don't know.
I didn't do like COVID lockdown stuff when we came back and clubs opened up. I didn't do anything like that. And I was just
Yeah.
like, I'm leaving. Everyone else can do that. I'm just going with my own material.
Yeah. That's kind of challenging. It's impressive to not do it because there's such a temptation to talk about it, but then it gets very trite very quickly. You hear the same topic.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say when you go to an open mic, so often comedians were talking about how high they got, the time they got so high, or how drunk, and that topic. And there were a few like that, or online dating, or there was a few topics that would get so much attention that it's just you feel like you got to just avoid it. There's just no way to get
Yeah.
anything new on that subject.
Yeah.
Um,
It's been most of these subjects have been covered so well. That is
yeah,
why it's just like it's just so hack to even try. I always
aside,
like to try and like ask guests because it sounds like you've gigged a lot over all over the place. Is
yeah.
like what is the most like unusual, weird place like you've ever done comedy?
I did I think it was sort of the last, let's say, big gig I did. It was a private gig last February or March. I met a guy. Oh, in fact, it was when I was opening for that woman I told you who had that show on the Catholic channel.
Yeah,
I was opening for her at a place called City Winery in New York. And a guy in the audience there with his wife, he saw the show and then he asked me, would I do a show for him? He was a priest in an Armenian Orthodox church in Queens. And he asked me, then months later, he got in touch, would you do this show? We are rededicating, we renovated, we have a whole new social hall. So I went last winter and performed for this packed room full of their congregation. This Armenian Orthodox priest introduced me, and it ended up being a really funny gig. But I have some jokes that touch on religious stuff and like
yeah.
Jesus. I have one joke that touches on Jesus, and they ended up going really well. But I did preface them. I was like, as I was getting to that joke, I was like, out loud. I was like, not sure how this is going to go over in the basement of a church, but with your permission, Father, I hope. Anyway, so it worked out really well. But that I would say that was not a venue I would have expected when I was
Mm-mm.
contemplating a career in
Right.
comedy. I didn't contemplate myself.
Do you do quite a lot of private gigs? Is that quite a
I
thing?
was doing that since the pandemic. That was the lion's share of my work. Yeah. And it
Right,
was
cool.
always the same thing. It was if someone happened to see me at a gig at a club and then said, "Oh, we're having this thing." I had another one that was a really good one, which was just for a guy's 80th birthday party. He and his wife saw me do 10 minutes at a club, and then they said, "Oh, we're having this big party." And this was a super fancy house up in the suburbs where they hired they had a band. They had a oh, actually this was kind of funny. They had a like a string quartet before I got there, like very posh, super
That is
fancy house out in
very
the garden.
posh.
Yeah, very posh. It was out in the garden between there. They had a house, but then they also had this little extra house out back. So the string quartet catered with waiters all dressed up. And then after me, they then asked, "Oh, in addition to doing your comedy, would you mind emceeing? Because we have this drag show afterwards." So they hired this troupe of drag performers.
Right.
But when I got on stage, the host, the woman who hired me, the wife of the guy whose birthday was, what she said to the audience of about 40 of her friends was, since they had just heard a string quartet, she said, "So now we're going to go from high culture, yeah, yeah, to low." She actually
Oh
said
my God. What a way to introduce
it was
someone.
the worst. It might be the worst intro I've ever had, and I couldn't let it go. So without being rude to my host and to the person who was paying me,
Yeah.
I took the microphone and I said, "Thank you for that introduction, but I just want to say, I did have a career before this singing classical music. And as someone who came out of the classical music world and as now in comedy, I have to correct you and say, the classical music is the low culture, and you're about to have a half hour of the high culture," which
Yeah.
gotta
Brilliant.
laugh. But then also she apologized, and I felt bad that I made her feel bad. But I said, no, it's fine. I just, but I couldn't let it go. It was really the worst intro in history.
The things that goes through people's head when they're doing intros.
Yeah,
And to just go, here's Here's some scum.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Here's some trash. Yeah, that's nice. I also have to say the Stand was one of my favorite gigs ever. That club also
Yeah,
just
yeah,
had an incredibly warm vibe. The audience was great, and the way it's configured, it almost feels like theater in the round
yeah.
because you're kind of
It's
facing the audience a little
the Stand
horizontally.
Glasgow is like it's like kind of known as like one of the best places to do comedy.
Yeah, that was great.
Glasgow
Laughs.
is just like a hot, hot room. It's hard to die on your ass in Glasgow. They say
It's hard to what?
it's hard to bomb.
Oh, okay. But
Yeah,
what was the phrase you used?
we call it die on your arse.
Oh, dial your lives.
Die on your arse. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
die
that's
on
it.
your. Ah, okay. Oh,
So that's it. People normally say that, being like, "Oh my god, you'll never guess what I died on my ass last night."
yeah,
But it's just it's yeah, another one for just straight out bomb.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's
So
a
there we go. You
special.
can introduce that when you get back into comedy.
Yeah, very nice. Die on your ass.
There was a few things I always kind of ask guests. We've kind of covered
Please.
one of them, like your weirdest place you've ever
Yeah.
basement of a church. That's brilliant. I always ask people about like the best gigs and the worst gigs.
Oh yeah.
I think a
Oh,
bad gig story is something that everyone can unite around.
so well, I told you the bad gig moment, which was out in Michigan when I did
Yeah.
my killer child trafficking joke that's insulting all of the audience
Yeah.
somehow. Maybe they were victims. I don't know. Let me think. Another really a really bad gig. Oh well, I will say that maybe the first time that guy in Pennsylvania I mentioned, David Kay, who has that company Slapsticks, he produces a lot of shows. So one of the first times he had me out for a professional gig where I was the middle or the feature act doing 20 minutes. It was one of the first times I was doing that, and I think I was a little nervous, and also I hadn't done 20 minutes many times.
Right.
So I
Okay.
was in my head a little bit about what's happening. And so as a result, I skipped a little chunk of my material. So
Right.
I probably skipped a 3 or 4 minute chunk.
Okay.
So then I came up short on my time. So then I knew that something was off. I didn't know what was off exactly. So I did that thing, which, I ended up, because I felt something was wrong, I got a little sweaty. Like, you feel a
Oh,
little,
right. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
sweat. And then also, then you get in your head.
Yeah.
So then it is a subtle thing where you want to be in your head. You have to be kind of
Yeah.
in front of your material. You have to be in front of yourself. You have to be out ahead. If you're suddenly on your heels and behind it a little bit, and then you can be in a headspace where you're kind of watching yourself or hearing yourself a little bit. And I wouldn't say by any stretch that it fell apart or that whatever, but the guy who hired me, David, he definitely came up to me after and we talked, and he could sense, he was like, yeah, yeah. And then he hired me again. He took me all
All
the way
right.
down to Virginia. This was maybe the worst gig now that I'm talking about it, because there I went and did material for him. It was at a club in a place called Newport News, Virginia, a little town. And I remember it was a weird place because they had Fox News, it felt like a very right wing, like
Yeah.
Republican room. And they had Fox News playing on the TVs behind the bar during the gig, which was bizarre. So I think I had the feeling like maybe I'm in enemy territory. I don't know. I wasn't feeling completely at home. And then also the place that they housed us, this was one of the only gigs I had where they had an apartment. The club owned an apartment.
All right.
But I had learned from David that a few months earlier, a comedian had died, like not died on his ass, but actually died in bed,
Holy
in bed
shit.
in the comedian apartment. So then David was like burning sage as like a kind of ritual, like to kind of do an exorcism or whatever. There was just a bad vibe around the whole gig. So I was up on stage, and I remember the Fox News thing, the dead body, the whole thing. I was feeling a little weird. And then,
That is such a bad omen for a gig.
yeah. And then the audience was not responding to you have certain jokes that at a certain point, are really the meat and potatoes of your gig, where
Yeah.
they're going to work, they're going to get the big laughs. And if those aren't working, you can really start to feel like, oh boy, this is not.
We're screwed. Yeah.
Yeah, you're screwed, and you start thinking about the clock, and you're like, oh God, I have to do 15. I've probably done 7. What am I going to do? And I remember specifically, I have one joke that I did where it's going to sound to you like all of my jokes are about being a vegan. They're not, but it just so happens that this joke was about I have a joke where I was like, they say you know give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Not if he's a vegan. Give a vegan a fish, he'll give you a lecture.
Yeah.
That's the opening of the joke. Teach him to fish. Anyway, but when I started that joke, a guy sitting in the front row with his feet up on another chair, very relaxed, seemed sort of unengaged. I think when I started this joke, he just said to me, he said, fish.
What a heckle.
Just repeated the word fish back to me. I just remember it felt to me as a particularly bleak moment in all of
Yeah.
my decades of going on stage to give people a little entertainment. Just having this guy in a very relaxed way just repeat the word fish back to me, it felt like a low point. So
Yeah.
when the
As
gig
Fox
ended,
News plays in the background and
yes,
the ticker
Fox News in the
tape.
background, the dead body, the smell of sage, and this guy saying the word fish. I remember what happened was when my 15 minutes were up, I got in my car and drove 7.5 hours back to Brooklyn because I needed to just get this whole experience out of my,
Get
and
hell
as
when you
a
get
result,
showered.
yeah, and I had to get home and get showered and put like several states, like put Virginia and Maryland and Delaware between me and that horrible room. But as a result, I then had to chase them. I had to um, I had to chase them for several months to get my check. Like they were
Right.
expecting to see me after the gig to get my check. They ended up paying me, but because usually you would just hang around after and you'd watch the
Yeah.
headliner perform and then have a drink or whatever. But I was just the hell out of there. So that would be my worst gig ever. Yes.
Wow,
Yeah.
man. That is
Yeah.
comedian dying on the site of the gig.
Yes. Yeah.
Nothing good is happening at that gig ever. That is
Yeah.
trouble. That's
I
fucked.
think.
Just the final thing before you go, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
I basically get guests to suggest someone that they would recommend as a future guest of this
Yeah.
podcast. Anyone you find funny,
Oh.
I'll try and get them on.
Oh, I would definitely get Mike Kaplan,
Yeah,
MYQ Kaplan, one of the funniest comedians, funniest joke writers that I know, and he's been to Edinburgh, and I assume
sweet.
he'll probably be coming back.
And
Yeah,
then the final thing is, I can imagine you will have something for this. Is that I ask guests to do a recommendation of any like TV shows,
yeah,
albums, films they've seen
yeah.
recently that they would recommend
Um,
to other people.
oh, so yeah. So my favorite comedy special of the last year, and I ended up having him on my show. His name is Django Gold. So
Okay.
Django is like the jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt.
Mm-hmm.
EG. Here, I'm going to look up the name of his special because it's just an incredible special. Oh, Bag of Tricks. That's the name of his special. Bag
Nice.
of
Bag of
Tricks.
tricks.
It's on YouTube. It's really brilliant. And I was then very happy because I watched it and then invited him. He came on the show. I was very happy last week. The New York Times named it also as one of their favorite specials of the year.
Brilliant.
So, and in fact, you should have him on your show too. Just a really funny, smart
Love
joke
it.
writer. Yeah.
Love that, man. Thank you
Gold.
very much.